Social Psychology Video 1, Solomon Asch's Conformity Experiment. In the 1950s, a psychologist named Solomon Asch asked 50 male students from Swarthmore College to participate in a simple experiment. The young men were shown two cards. One card had one line of a particular length, while the other card had three lines of varying length. Participants were then asked to determine which of the three lines on the second card was the most similar in length to the line on the first card. Each line test was deemed a trial, and there were 18 trials in total, with 8 participants assigned to each. Of the 8 participants, 7 were Confederates, meaning they were hired by the experimenter, and only 1 was a real participant. In most of the trials conducted, it was obvious which line on card 2 was most similar to the line on card 1. However, in 12 of the 18 trials, called the critical trials by Asch, Confederates deliberately gave incorrect answers. There was also a control trial which only had the real participant and no Confederates, but most of the trials had the real participants with the fake ones. The goal of the experiment was to measure the extent to which social pressure from a majority group affected a person's conformity, or an individual's tendency to follow the unspoken rules or behaviors of the social group to which she or he belongs. Would the real participants conform to the majority answer, even if the answer was obviously wrong? The results consisted of a high degree of conformity in the critical trials and a low degree of conformity in the control trial. 75% of participants conformed in at least one critical trial. However, in the control group, less than 1% gave the incorrect answer. While a few participants thought that the incorrect group answers were correct, the majority did not. Most of the participants justified their decision to conform to an incorrect majority by saying that they didn't want to be ridiculed or seen as peculiar for giving an opposing view. Their explanations reflected a normative influence and an informational influence on the participants from the majority group. Normative influence is the social influence resulting in conformity so that an individual can fit in with a group. Informational influence is the assumption an individual makes that others around him are correct and better informed than he is. Overall, this experiment indicated that people have a tendency to conform to group opinion, even if they think that opinion is wrong. Asch replicated his own experiment in further trials and determined which factors increased or decreased conformity. Large group size, ambiguous line lengths, and higher status peers tended to increase conformity. If the group size was below 4, participants were less likely to give the incorrect group answer. However, as group size increased, conformity increased as well. What's more, if the lengths of the lines on card 2 were more similar in length to one another, therefore making it more difficult to tell which one was more similar to the line on card 1, the participant was more likely to go along with the group consensus, since the right answer was less clear. If the participant's peers were higher status, i.e. one was his boss or his teacher, he was also more likely to conform. Factors that decreased conformity were group answers that were not unanimous and participant answers given in private. If a participant had an answer that differed from the majority, but there was just one person who agreed with the real participant, he would be less likely to conform to the incorrect majority. Also, if he were given his answer in private, he would be under no group influence and answer more correct. There have been a few criticisms lodged at the Asch Conformity experiment. Because only college-educated Caucasian men were included in the experiment, the participants were not a representative sample of the American population, and so the study lacked population validity. The task itself had low ecological validity, meaning it was artificial and unlikely to be experienced by an individual in real life. There were ethical issues involved as well, because Asch didn't shield the people in the experiment from possible psychological distress. In addition, he overlooked a possible reason for conformity, a desire on the participant's part to avoid conflict with his peer group. Asch also didn't take into consideration the fact that he was testing young men, who tend to be more impressionable than older men. Lastly, the experiment was criticized for its deception. The participants were told that they were undergoing a vision test, not one about conformity. However, the deception was key to this study. Had the men known what it was about, they may have realized what was happening in the critical trials and the results would have been less valid. Regardless of its flaws, the Asch Conformity experiment is considered one of the classics of social psychology because it sought to characterize an individual's susceptibility to peer pressure and measured the extent to which he would conform to an incorrect majority. While the levels of conformity found in this study contrast sharply with similar studies conducted in later decades, Asch's findings were deemed culturally significant, indicative of a less individualistic culture in 1950s America.